world. It's been a while, but we're back, and we've got a lot to catch up on. So today, very quickly, we're going to go back through the Legacy Antigen, looking at community chapters 3 to 6, and comic parts 4 to 7, along with the Valkyrie audio-visual short, Rest Easy, and the first issue of the Overtime physical comic release. But we have to start where we stopped, or more accurately, with the chapter that made me stop. Wraith is some of the most contrived bullshit I've read in a while, and I still admittedly just kind of don't really want to talk about it. But it kind of really deserves its own actual video to break down all of its multiple flaws, but as I'm not really prepared to do that, we're just going to look at it in very general terms, as the overarching issue with this chapter is the lack of weight that the events themselves carry, which then cheapens the ultimate emotional resolution that Bangalore and Wraith reach way too easily. This comes from everything being based largely on coincidences brought about through forced retconning, along with a series of nonsensical character actions and a lack of direct, knowing conflict established between the two, as Voidwalker didn't actually choose to hurt Bangalore. That wasn't something she knowingly did when she took the pen drive. She didn't do it to hurt Bangalore, she did it just because it benefited her. And that ultimately demeans all the accusations that Bangalore has made against Wraith up until this point. It cheapens all the tension that had been built, because apparently it really didn't justify that level of aggression. If Bangalore had jumped out from behind the console as Voidwalker went to go into the portal, and had asked Voidwalker to give it back, and Voidwalker chose not to, that would have made Bangalore feel way more justified in hating Wraith, and it would actually give Wraith some kind of repercussions to consider about herself. You then could have made it even more impactful, again, as mentioned before, if Voidwalker had been responsible for the explosion on the IMS Hestia, actually responsible for separating Bangalore and her brother, or even if Voidwalker had been the unnamed Ares scientist who became very close to Jackson on board the Hestia, which Bangalore could see as a parallel to how they lost Zeke to his manipulative girlfriend. All of those options that were set up by the story already were a much better choice than forcing this event in this situation. Crypto being on King's Canyon doesn't seem to make much sense unless you imagine he's searching for caustic. How he was only able to get an audio version of the file doesn't make much sense even for today's technology, and then makes even less sense about why he had to send Bangalore into the physical location. You then have things in Sing Labs, like Bangalore hiding in an open room, which makes no sense. Voidwalker just taking the drive that she must have seen was downloading a video on another console to put in a new console, and not suddenly beg the question that, hey, isn't there another person in this room? Hey, you hiding in that corner, wait a minute, what are you doing? It also detracts from Voidwalker actually turning up at Sing Labs, because even though she used to work there, she somehow turned up without the ability to access the files she wanted. Again, you then have Bangalore not fighting for the drive, or saying to anything for Wraith for so long, despite apparently not really knowing about her and Voidwalker swapping dimensions, which also makes no sense as Pathfinder's Quest, the book, is apparently canon to the Apex Legends universe. Everybody knows about how Pathfinder saved the Outlands, so everybody should know that Voidwalker and Wraith are two different people. So not only does none of it actually make sense in just the physical actions that happened, the characters made decisions that also don't make any logical sense in situ, and the ultimate conflict that these two ladies have been sort of opposed over doesn't have any actual personal attachment between them. So the conflict that we've been experiencing since the end of Season 8 doesn't feel organic or meaningful anymore. Bangalore insisting that Wraith actively hurt her and has no right to say her brother's name, when even Voidwalker didn't know what she was getting into at the time, feels like a gross overstatement of intent on Bangalore's part. That she's attacking someone who had no context for what she was causing at the time, and definitely doesn't now. I understand the idea of laying blame, and that's how Bangalore copes emotionally here, especially as she seems constantly defeated by this final thing that always gets in the way. That's very relatable, but it doesn't justify her behavior as being proportional. It doesn't feel believable that she would have been this mad over something that you can very clearly see wasn't done to actively hurt her. You can argue emotional irrationality and how people aren't perfect all you want. If you're trying to make a satisfying story, going that way kind of cheapens your emotional conflict, as we've seen here. I'm also left not really caring who owned the pilot knife anymore. Like, the only way I thought that could actually be impactful is if it had belonged to Voidwalker, and if it had some evidence about how she had contributed to Bangalore and Jackson being separated. So not only is this chapter bad on its own right, it detracts a lot from the prior work that was done building up to it. The comic chapters that led up to here, and personally, it kind of ruins Voidwalker a lot as well. That it's introducing a lot of elements of coincidence to a story that seemed to be much more grounded in character agency. And I don't think I'm really alone in my criticisms of this chapter, as Tom Casiello, the guy who wrote the damn thing, made a massive thread pointing out that he sees all of its issues, that it's hollow and that it's forced to fit into an event that it really didn't need to be. To use his words, they 3PO'd it, where stuff just lined up because they wanted it to. But he seems to also feel that where they got the characters is justified regardless of the weak framing device, which I would super argue it's not. He wants us to be happy for these characters getting to this point, and I'm left feeling that I would have been happy for these characters if they actually had something to overcome, and if overcoming it had felt earned, which it doesn't. However, I do have to give praise concerning this chapter to Jell. I'm well aware that Jell has had a lot of influence on this season, and I think you can really feel that. It was a very good choice to have her do this chapter specifically, as it's characters I'm sure she's very engaged with, and her presentation, lettering, and paneling is among like the cleanest across the season so far, which is very fitting for the nature of this chapter, which was fitting a bunch of retcons into an existing timeline that was involving multiple dimensions, and it got a lot of people confused. I think that she iterated on what the writers wanted very well to fit it into the story that we have. It's the ideas that the writers had and the actions that they wanted characters to do, that's what I have a problem with. I think Jell executed on this story very well, but I think the story itself is the problem. Her art is absolutely gorgeous, like Wraith's big old smile is amazing to see, she looks like a different person. Jackson Williams is an absolutely handsome-ass motherfucker, and I am just left wondering a little bit what his deal is, where he's connected, where the fuck is he, and why the fuck hasn't he gone and found Anita yet? Especially as it's going to be much more likely for the Williams siblings to find each other than it is for us to find Voidwalker in an entire other dimension just to get the drive back. Finally, at the end, nice little progression with Lifeline's detective story going to find Chico Sortel. Nothing too huge here, she knows what she's got to do and she's going about getting it done. So let's move away from hopefully the longest section of this video today onto Chapter 5 of the in-game comics, Haunted by Broken Ghosts, and it's nice to see the legacy of Season 5 still hangs over us. But as we get into things, it's really nice to see Caustic being put in his place a bit, Bloodhound becoming more confident thanks to Fuse. I think those three have been really good this season in rounding out each other's harsher edges and promoting some of each other's harsher edges as well. I think they've all become much more rounded across the last season or two. But none of that really compares to Loba just flat out admitting that she loves Bangalore. That's a fantastic moment from this chapter. Valk was really useful for prompting that sort of information, as much as I find her super overbearing thus far. It's also nice to see when we go to Caustic and Crypto that Caustic is the one who seems to be showing more care for his mother, which really isn't the way that I expected this to balance out. Crypto seems to be keeping much more of his emotional involvement suppressed here. But, again, this being the in-game comics, I do have my issues with them still. This end bit where Caustic points out that somebody else knows who we both are, Crypto, and Loba is sat right there? Yeah, I mean, like, throw subtlety out the window, why don't we? Like, you could have just left no one there, and leave it up to us to remember back to the Broken Ghost, which you helped us do by putting Broken Ghosts in the title, so we didn't really need Loba to be sat there, and we could have remembered that, yeah, Loba knows secrets about Caustic, she knows who he is. I mean, you could have at least had her sitting fucking further away, so she wasn't obviously in earshot of the conversation, making both Caustic and Crypto look stupid. I also again have to point out that the line work in the in-game comics is super ugly, especially when you compare it to all the fantastic work that the community artists have been doing. I do like their colorist, I think they've done really good work on all the in-game stuff they've been involved with, but ultimately this season has personally suffered on a visual level. This even comes through in the clarity of reading the story. The final page, it's really hard to know who is actually speaking on that final page. It seems to be led in from Bloodhound, but it doesn't have the accentuations that make it seem like it's coming over the speaker, and it feels much more like a general piece of narration than someone distinctly speaking. This final page also has some really interesting paneling, but it feels like they didn't know what they were making it for. This visual feels like a claw scratch, which would have made sense if we were going after prowlers or something like that, but going after spiders. You could have maybe split the page into 8, like the legs, with a central piece for who was more focal or who was actually speaking the dialogue across that last page. Like, the claw marks make it very clear that yes, we're going hunting. It's an interesting attempt at doing something different with the paneling, but it seems like they just didn't know what they were making it for, which makes the whole thing feel less cohesive. So, on to somebody who really does know what they were getting themselves into. We're going to Community Chapter 5, Measuring the Marigolds. And as with Gel in Wraith, as with, in fact, all the community artists across this season, bringing Rhonnie back in to reprise their role visualizing Mirage and Rampart is great not just for consistency, but for bringing dedicated, compassionate artists to their relevant places. The artists at Dark Horse could really take a note from Rhonnie here, in that this is how you do a stylized yet realistic human face that also expresses clear emotion. The community artists, again, are really putting the Dark Horse people in their place with this work. Ronnie's distinctly thick line work really makes their work stand out as theirs, and you can really feel that they put a lot into a story that they actually care about. And this is a story person you really can care about. It's a very relatable, grounded interpersonal conflict of Ramia just moving out. As much as her and Mirage have a lot of strife between them, that's obviously going to hurt them both on an emotional level, no matter how it could have been better for them both. This chapter particularly has what I think is the strongest dialogue overall, as these two genuinely do feel like a warring family, and it's got some of the most emotive physicality in how the characters move and act as well. Path's nervous twitching as he shows some sort of growth in his emotional intelligence was really fun and helped to balance out these two much more lively characters. And on top of that, Evelyn Witt is the absolute shining star of this chapter, the caring yet no-nonsense mother that we all kind of need to keep us at our best. The way that she prompts Mirage into having his light bulb moment is a really cool way of showing how someone develops through their own modes of displaying affection. Relating to each other is difficult, and it's incredibly difficult to purely love one individual person. The fact that we can love each other despite our differences and the things that wind us up about each other is the test of where real family lies. This chapter was really cool, really hit me in the feels. I like at the end that Ramia shows that she's always been the more emotionally mature big sister all along, realizing how much impact Mirage's dad could have on proceedings, but I'd imagine that we are going to see something from him as we go a bit further through the season. Just at the end of that chapter, Lifeline pops up again, and Rhonnie gives us this real twist in style as we have this sinister, shadowed Creighton Sortel, and the revelation that he and Duardo Silva are looking at controlling far more than just the planet Samathi. It seems we could be seeing some kind of internal takeover of even the Syndicate-controlled space of the Outlands sometime soon. And that would put us in a pretty vulnerable position, which moves us quite nicely onto in-game Chapter 6, a vulnerable position, finally giving the Valkyrie shippers everything they wanted, and then ripping the rug out from underneath them. This is a pretty good chapter on a character front. Not a lot exactly happens, but a lot of what we get to learn is actually really impactful. Valk shows us exactly what she thinks of herself and her history, but also proves that she's kinda arrogant to assume that that experience relates directly to Loba's issue. It's a good way to help force that issue of how Loba can work within her revenge, but it also then shows how the two clash despite their similarities. The two flirty, openly queer ladies shouldn't just automatically be paired together. And Valk is kind of on the wrong side of that argument. She's trying way too hard to get in Loba's pants at exactly the wrong time. Kind of shows to me that she's a bit selfish, which I think is a nice flaw for her to have, but it also suggests a much more emotional element there, that she has problems distancing herself personally from conflict. Even though Valk herself seems to be more built around surpassing and moving past revenge, whereas Loba seems to almost need to fully execute on her revenge to reach the same place. Just because they both have the same kind of issue doesn't mean that they need to resolve it emotionally in the same way. And just final little note, not too much to say on this chapter, The sound design was pretty good for this chapter. I really liked the pacing of the two ladies rolling down the hill. That was really well timed. But then the spider started out pretty nice in like pacing between panels, getting slightly louder each time. But then in the final panel where it actually appears and screams, Valk has like an entire paragraph of dialogue to say. It just kind of ruins the overall pacing that she had like lines upon lines to say while a spider screeched in her ear. It didn't feel very cohesive to read. And speaking of cohesion, the spiders themselves seem a bit illogical to me as well, that they're supposed to emit toxic gas from their abdomens, yet one, Valk seems okay covered in their blood, and two, they hunt with pack tactics, and seemingly, as you'll find out in a chapter or so, by actually disabling their prey first, with webs. It's like, how is this the spider that you've told us about? Do you know what I mean? It's not a big deal, it just feels really incongruent. Feels like they don't know exactly what they were trying to do. And speaking of not knowing what they were trying to do, let's jump out of the game, out of Twitter, and into the physical release that I'm really upset I got. Overtime 1. If you've seen anything about the Overtime comic, you should know this already. The art is terrible. It looks like the artist didn't know who he was dealing with. There's this random like default Octane pose somewhere. None of the legends look like themselves, and none of them look aesthetically pleasing, and never even mind Revenant that I'm pretty sure the artist thinks is a cyborg. The physical locations also don't make sense in various panels that when it seems we're inside, we're in fact outside, and then we go back. The narration is overly cluttered with interrupting speech bubbles, blocking you out from the flow of the narration. The narration itself feels very stiff. It feels like the characters themselves are just caricatures of the characters we know, and especially when you come to someone like Revenant, their motivations really don't line up with what we understand, in that Revenant is apparently performing assassinations for either Hammond or the Syndicate again. That's an interesting thing to consider, but having it dropped in a piece that feels like it doesn't understand the world that it's working inside, it feels like it just doesn't understand Revenant, and this is wrong. The story itself doesn't have a lot going on for us. It's set all the way back in Season 8, which means that release dates might have kind of fucked with it, but it does seem to open us up a little bit more into the Syndicate and the mysterious QW. I'm sure they say his surname in the book. I honestly can't remember it right now. I don't really care. I'm not opening that piece of shit back up to check. But it does seem pretty indicative of a tie to either Duardo Silva or the Icarus fleet, as this was building into some greater political aspects of the Outlands reaching in towards Season 9. And my final big criticism about this, and a big part of why the character writing also didn't feel like it was done by someone familiar with the characters themselves, is that Mirage sort of starts this emotional theme at the beginning of the story about having a lack of friends or a lack of friendship, and that's not really built on in any meaningful way throughout the middle of the chapter, and then at the very end, when this briefcase that Mirage and Crypto have been after is nearly being stolen by Revenant, and Revenant has Crypto in a headlock, threatening Mirage to give him the briefcase in exchange, Mirage just jumps over the edge of a building saying, "I have no friends," and it feels like it comes out of complete nowhere. It was set up at the beginning in like one sentence, like really bluntly and overbearingly, like as if it was the writer talking to us that Mirage feels like he doesn't have friends, rather than Mirage talking about how he feels he doesn't have any friends. And then at the end, it just comes back out of kinda nowhere to have him jump off a building over something that he really doesn't care about, in a situation that he really doesn't give a shit about and he's not actually really involved in. Overtime is pretty terrible, as far as concerned. I would actually give it a lower rating than Wrong Wraith. At least Wrong Wraith looks nice. Dark Horse, get your act together, I'm afraid. Sorry. But from there, let's rest easy as we check out the Valkyrie-led audio-visual teaser, Rest Easy. And I shouldn't really say too much about this. I'm just going to point you to it and tell you to listen to it in its entirety. This is some heartfelt shit, man. Like, I won't be able to do it justice by commenting on it, essentially. Ultimately, it's a great expansion on Valkyrie's compassionate side and her desire to make her own life for herself, again showing how distinct her and Loba's idea of revenge actually are. Loba's is much more tied into being relevant to Revenant, whereas Viper's encounter with revenge is all about pushing past the attachment to her father, right? And speaking of ties, this also ties back to the loading screen that shows Valkyrie and her mum scattering Viper's ashes. That and Rest Easy as an accompanying piece work together to create this very relatable and human way of approaching death, regret, and like making your own legacy. it's dealt with severe weight, but also with a very personally relatable humor to it. It feels very Valkyrie, and it feels very real. Erika Ishii, Valkyrie's voice actress, absolutely slays this piece. Like, you can really tell it's coming from somewhere deeply personal to her. So again, I would just say go and check it out in its entirety. It's worth more than I can tell you it's worth. And if you really enjoy Erika Ishii herself, I very recently watched her take part in a D&D playthrough as the Spider Queen Lilith, putting on an incredibly different affectation to how she plays Valk, which would be interesting to see in the first place. I've then also seen a full-on hour-long discussion with her and Brennan Lee Mulligan about the power of Dungeons & Dragons and storytelling, and how it can work to people's benefit in exploring their own sort of emotional place in the world. Erika is actually seemingly a very intelligent woman. That is some really cool shit, and it'll give you some really cool insight into how and why Erika applies to Valkyrie so well. And talking of applying to things well, it's time to see the return of artist Genta coming back to represent Octane, following on from their piece at the end of Season 7. And, like, that one was good. This chapter has stepped it up even one more notch. Like, the visual style here absolutely slays. Like, this proper, like, horror noir aesthetics that's going on, and the disjointed way that the panels clunk into each other, and Duardo Silva himself literally, like, treading on the very beginning of this story, showing you visually exactly how this man applies to the world around him. That is some cool fucking shit. The one thing that I will say about this chapter that makes me a little puzzled is we're now seeing some disparity in when color chapters are being used with the community chapters. Gel had set up a really nice thematic visual language from the beginning of using largely black and white with splashes of color, that things like The Truth Comes Out replicated really well. A bunch of the other chapters were just in like muted tones or in black and white, which still sort of fit, but then you have this chapter and Sins of the Father, the very first community chapter, which were just sort of inexplicably in color. I like the color, it looks amazing. I don't want to take that away from either of those chapters at all. They both look incredible. It just makes me wonder why that some are in color and some aren't. I'd actually make an argument that something like Measuring the Marigolds probably could have benefited from color in some way. Not to take away again from Ronnie's art, I think that all the community artists have done a fantastic job across the season. It does just make me wonder about sort of a sense of inconsistency, and maybe something that the community artists would consider making a bit more cohesive in future. That would be cool to see. What's not cool to see is Duardo Silva, and how he fucking twists the knife. Like, I really like how this is done in that he gives Octane exactly what he wants. What Octane says he wants. He doesn't want the expectation of his father looming over him. And yeah, Duardo takes that away. But in doing so, it's not just business. He takes away any shred of possible care that he could have had for Octane. Which hurts so much more. Like, that is some painful shit to have a parent just put you down like that. That is horrible. And that's such a clever way to have Duardo feel like this incredibly emotionally manipulative villain. Like, he evidently has some kind of emotional dominance over Octane, which is very surprising considering Octane. It's really weird to see this almost submissive side of him that his dad evidently brings out of him, and not through bugging him about trying to live up to his legacy, but giving up on him and the legacy that Octane never wanted, but he wanted his dad to accept that he didn't want it, rather than just taking it away from him because he didn't care for him at all. That's some heavy, like, complicated emotional situation in there. That's really damn good, especially for a character like Octane that a lot of people do seem to see as much more one-dimensional than that would suggest. But then, at the end, finally, Lifeline turns up to save the day. I like how she's been popping in and out the end of all these community chapters, but I would have at least liked to see her struggle a bit more emotionally along the way, like with the idea of helping Octane. Maybe if she'd seen some of her parents' coldness in him or something like that, she would have felt a bit more reticent about going to his aid. But that's seemingly something that will more come after this moment in order to create more strife in their long-term relationship, that their trust has been damaged. And it's cool then obviously to see her put that aside so she can swap up their role dynamic
and take up that sort of protector role that Octane had assigned himself to her all the way back in Season 7. It's nice to see that she's grown and learnt from that experience to be able to stand up to Duardo Silva where Octane needs her the most. And finally, as Lifeline accuses him of it, I'm gonna happily say, yeah, Duardo Silva very likely summoned the Icarus. Obviously, Lifeline is accusing him of it, but hey, I accused him of potentially doing it way before this chapter, so he seems a pretty strong candidate. There's Ash's numerical codes that Octane and Lifeline recognized, which are obviously tied to Olympus, and obviously had some specific function that Octane and Lifeline somewhat feared. And the whole way through this chapter, you had Duardo Silva spouting the word legacy over everything. Given his high position in the Outland Society, and the amount of use that Silva Pharmaceuticals could make out of the Medusa Vines or the Legacy Antigen, definitely suggests that it's something he'd want to get his hands on in order to upset the political structure of an entire galaxy, or at least of the Outlands. And he wouldn't even have to just do it through military might, he could just make Silva Pharmaceuticals the sole provider of the Legacy Antibody, being the only place where anyone could get a cure for the Legacy Antigen, establishing political and financial control over the Outlands for Duardo Silva and Silva Pharmaceuticals, no longer held back by the abrasive, irresponsible Octavio Silva. But he's obviously not going to get what he wants, and nobody wants a peacekeeper to the face, but I'm sure we're all very glad to see Lifeline turning up to pick our boy back off the ground. And finally, picking up our own final pieces as we come to the final chapter we'll discuss today, the in-game comic, Part 7, The Terrible Truth About Alexander Knox. And to be honest, I'm just going to skip right to the important panel here. This reveal hurt. Ouch. Right? I think we all knew something was wrong, but it was a real shock to have it put so bluntly and so just out and heavy. Very interesting that Caustic was finally able to tell this to Crypto as well. The paneling that they actually used following this is much better than my earlier example, in that this panel here gave that reveal time to breathe, to set in, to show that that's something that we all have to think about and consider what that means and how it applies to the situation as we know it. And damn, yeah, unfortunate, yet again just adds this bit of a further dimension to the seemingly very uncomplicated Caustic. And as I sort of mentioned last time, the spiders don't really make a ton of sense, especially when you've got the whole cliche thing they're actually shown to do in this chapter, where they wrap people up with webs and take them back to a lair. Realistic giant spiders would have injected you with the enzyme that would turn you into juice by now. Theoretically, all of these characters are dead already. This isn't how spiders really work. But, yeah, you know what, fine. It's a cliche for a reason. It at least works in situ to create some sort of sense of tension. I don't feel that they're in any trouble, but I'm glad to see them feel like they're in trouble. I'm not sure how to put that. This isn't as bad as I kind of feel it really is. Especially as it gives us some setup for Fuse and Bloodhound finally getting some love throughout this season as our saving graces for the gang trapped in the cave. But that then actually makes me wonder what's on offer for the other characters who've had even less screen time so far. Someone like Revenant, as Overtime revealed he's maybe working under the Syndicate's employ. Does he have some involvement in this? Is he some kind of enforcer for the upper echelons of the Outland Society? What about Horizon? Isn't it a little weird that she was the one to name the Legacy Antigen the Legacy Antigen? The loading screen from this season that reveals some clues about who actually summoned the Icarus does seem to imply that there's more than one person involved. And Horizon strikes me as someone who'd be very interested in seeing what could have been salvaged from Typhon, at least once she'd learned what happened there. And she's a character where it actually applies really well that even though she is a good and benevolent person, ultimately, nothing will stand in the way of her going back to her child. Nothing. That's what makes her such a compelling anti-hero in my eyes. And she's admittedly not been used anywhere near to that kind of potential just yet, but as she's been so casually involved this season and dropping a very specific term as if she already understood it in the Legacy Antigen just makes me a little suspicious, right? But with that, once you got into me spiraling out into obscurity, that's going to be enough from me for today. I think that means we're caught up with everything. I hope you've enjoyed my thoughts on the comics from this season thus far. I hope you've enjoyed the comics themselves. Come tell me if you did actually enjoy any of these that I didn't like, if you have any problems with anything else. Would you like to see the community artists just take over wholesale? Would that be better for the storytelling as a whole? I honestly wouldn't complain myself. But with that, I've been Euclidean Vision, the emotional support. Glad to be back making videos again. Take care of yourselves out there, teammates. And may the glorious light of Best Girl shine within you. Bye-bye.